Consider This with Carol Schrader is made possible with support from Allegiant Health, Bass and Associates, and Nebraskans for Public Television. Consider This with Carol Schrader, a news and information program recorded on the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. From the Fireside Lounge in the Milo Bale Student Center, here is your host, Carol Schrader.
Hello and welcome once again to the Milo Bale Student Center. Consider this. The thoroughbred racing industry in Nebraska is alive and well. Or is it? Well, we know it's had some troubles, and we're going to go through that a little, but talk about the future. With me today is Dennis Lee. He is honcho with the Nebraska Racing Commission. And
good morning or good afternoon.
Well, good afternoon. Whenever they'll see it at night, in the morning, in the afternoon, all over the board. And also with us today, thank you for coming, is Pete Gross. He is Vice President of Nebraska Breeders Association, Thoroughbred Breeders, and served as president, and spent some tough years in the business with the demise of our Nebraska spelled backwards here in Omaha. Dennis, I really, you know, it was some really sad times, and Pete can attest to this well, but it was for a lifelong Omahan, the demise of Ak-Sar-Ben as a track, regardless of how you feel about gambling or horse racing, was an incredible thing. Did you think that this was a death knell?
Well, I think we considered the fact that has the gambling in the Midwest gradually expanded. Really, when you think about it, up until about 1986, 87, we were the only game in town in terms of parimutuel horse racing. Prairie Meadows got started, the track in Kansas City got started, Canterbury Downs got started. But I think the real thing that had the most of a negative impact on the thoroughbred industry in Nebraska was the opening of the casino boats in Council Bluffs and the casino at Bluffs Run. You know, for years we were addressing the fact that there were Indian casinos up north of Omaha, and certainly you'd lose some of your horse patrons to those types of environments. But the racing industry, whether it's here in the Midwest or California, New York, or Florida, the traditional hotbeds of racing, you're not equipped as an industry to really combat or deal with expansion of gambling. You're never going to be able to address slot machines. People want the quick fix of a slot machine. We can't compete as an industry with blackjack. And so from that standpoint, we had to really readdress internally within the industry, how do we deal with this? And there's been some scaling back within the industry, and I think we've weathered the storm.
Well, I remember they built the track down south of us in Kansas City, and then Prairie Meadows certainly had its problems. And as we approach Derby Day here in Nebraska, which is in Kentucky actually is where they have it, but I mean we celebrate it all through American thoroughbred racing. I remember, gosh, public hearings and all kinds of things with the breeders, Pete coming in and talking about the impact. I forget the figure of the impact, let's say 10 years ago, that it was financially in the state.
Well, I believe it, well, probably at our peak, and I think close to, you know, even during the last part of Ak-Sar-Ben, I think we still had an impact of close to $300,000 a year.
300 million.
300 million, yes, 300,000.
And then there's that classic ripple effect that they talk about, the turnover. So I mean,
yeah, I mean, you know, when as a breeder, you know, Ak-Sar-Ben was the meat that you really shot for, because that was where the purse structure was. That's where the incentive was for the people who wanted to buy the Nebraska bred horses that you raised. With that meat, you know, there was a market for your horses, and when you lost that purse structure and that quality meat, it really took a toll on the breeding industry.
Well, the whole industry, I mean, the horses are, excuse the pun, a whole different breed. I mean, you've got, you know, when you've got a machine that you can plug money into, and it's just a matter of, I mean, horses are, and that's the beauty of horse racing, is that beautiful horse flesh and all, of course, all the work it entails.
And that's what really differentiates the racing industry, whether it's here, Arkansas, anywhere else in the country, from going across the river to one of the boats and sitting down at a blackjack table and playing $5 minimum blackjack, or getting a roll of quarters and playing slot machines. The big difference is, if you're going to be a horse racing fan, it's going to require you to study the horses and study who's in the field. We have a 20-horse field going Saturday in the Kentucky Derby. And anybody who's really serious about that, who challenges it and likes that challenge of trying to figure out which one of these 3-year-olds going 1.25 miles for the first time is going to be the best out of a 20-horse field. You got a filly mixed in there, and that's going to be an additional factor, and they're all carrying 128 pounds. Makes a big difference. You don't have that type of a challenge. The biggest challenge when you're playing slot machines, and I'm not a gambler, but the biggest challenge is how many quarters do we put in today? Do we do 1 or 8 quarters on this particular spin? It's not the same in the horse racing environment. You have factors concerning weight, the conditions of the race, the breeding of the horse, who the jockey is, what the trainer's background is. Is a horse coming back from going long, or does it like short distances? Some tracks you have to address turf races versus dirt races. All these factors are items that will change and will be variables from day to day.
Is the track muddy? I mean,
Exactly.
All right.
just give me a fast track. I have enough complications. Well, as I said, I grew up here and learned practically to read on the daily racing form. Not that my parents loved to go; they were not gamblers, but it was a family tradition. The Junior Jockey Club when I was growing up. But we had 5 racetracks in Nebraska, so the meet at any one, and there was some overlapping, as I recall. But I mean, it stretched from when to when, basically.
Well, the race season itself has always started with Fowler Park. And
Right.
Fowler Park has taken what I've always considered to be the worst days of racing and turned them into really a bonanza for the mid-Nebraska area. Fowler Park's done a great job, and we've started in February, and we would go. One year I remember I was up at Atticad behind the gate 2 weeks before Christmas in December, where it was snowing so hard you could barely see the grandstand. And so that would be really the outside of our racing season. And now it's a lot different. We're starting same dates in February with Fowler Park, but we'll have the season wrapped up by the end of September, the live season.
Okay, enter the demise of Exarban, then the percolation of the idea of replacing it. Now we have Horseman's Park, but we've lost Atticad, so we're back to 4, and Horseman's is a whole different ball game here right now. I mean, you don't have a place to raise your Nebraska thoroughbreds or your Iowa thoroughbreds, or just the ones that hang out here.
We've seen a change probably in the breeding industry. At our peak, we were probably raising close to 700 foals a year in the state of Nebraska. And now with the success that Prairie Meadows has had over the past few years, just in recent years, you've seen almost the numbers reverse. Iowa used to raise around 150 to 200 foals. Now Nebraska is raising 150 to 200 foals, and Iowa's raising close to 700 foals.
Of course, they've got gambling over there,
That's
other
right.
forms of gambling,
Yeah,
the casino to help
and their
keep those
purse
purses up.
those purses are 120,000 plus a day. And we don't have anything to compare with that right now in the state. But I've seen in the last couple of years, what a lot of Nebraska people have found is when they shipped their mares to Iowa, they weren't getting the care that they got here in Nebraska. And economics dictates that you've got to have a foal every year if you expect to make any money. And when your mare doesn't get the care, I'm not saying that happened all over the state of Iowa at all the different farms, but when you're used to keeping them at home and doing it yourself, it's a big impact. When things don't go right. And so I've seen a lot of the breeders that did go to Iowa for a while have started to come home again with the success that Horseman's Park has started to show. And we've actually had one of the sires that was in Iowa last year was a horse named Blooming Affair who ran in the Kentucky Derby and made over $800 and some thousand. He's in Nebraska now, and we've seen some other stallions that were in Iowa that have come back to Nebraska. So I think we're seeing some positive things. I think we're starting to see some reinvestment in livestock. The incentives still aren't quite there, but I think people that were in the business and still wanted to be in the business, they want to be back in the business, and I hope that's positive.
Can you excuse my total ignorance here? When you say Nebraska bred or Iowa bred, this is assuming that the physical act of breeding happens in that state?
No, well,
or do you have to live there?
Partially
I mean,
correct,
I don't know if it's a residency requirement.
Officer of the Breeders Association.
I know this sounds like a silly question.
A lot of times the conception can happen anywhere in the United States.
Oh.
But the foaling,
have to be
but the foaling usually happens within a certain state, and So Kentucky bred is foaled in Kentucky, Iowa bred is foaled in Iowa.
Well, I'm glad you cleared this up.
Nebraska bred. Of course, there are certain regulations by the different breed associations as to how much time you have to be in the state, and certain things that make you qualify to run in state-bred races.
And that, of course, is all sort of economically geared to keep the industry in that state healthy. I mean, if you could just ship, be born there and ship them out, then, I mean, the whole infrastructure, there is an infrastructure even that's spread across the
whatever
state.
state you go, and Pete is actually probably more aware of this than I am, but wherever state you go, if you look at the program at the races, many times there's a supplement for horses that are state breds. For example, at Fauner Park today, if there's a horse that runs at Fauner Park who's a Nebraska bred, and the foal papers are Nebraska bred papers, and that horse wins, many times that purse that horse shares in will be supplemented by the supplement that the breeders provide, the breeders organization provides to that race.
Sort of a premium.
Exactly. So there's an incentive to purchase a horse in that state, for this instance a Nebraska bred, have that horse stay in Nebraska and run, because it's going to make more money than if it crosses the river and runs over to Prairie Meadows. It's not an Iowa bred, and so if it wins a race in Iowa, it won't have a participation in that Iowa supplement.
Now, part of the reason that things are turning around a little has to do with Horseman's Park here in Omaha.
Oh, by far. Last year, for example, there was total dollars wagered in Nebraska, something like $152 million, which is, if you went back and looked at the records, markedly less than what we had in '87 and '88, which I consider to be our peak years of racing in Nebraska. Of that figure, Horseman's amounted for about $58 million of that. Now that's from a track that raced 2 days last year. Obviously, most of that handle came from the simulcasting that Horseman's Park generated.
Oh, by far most of it.
Oh, exactly. Not only just on the races in Nebraska that it received the in-state signal, but also, for example, tracks from around the country that send their signal to Horseman's. People go there and wager on those races, have lunch, have dinner, make a few wagers. That goes back to what I mentioned earlier, that the big difference between us as an industry and the people that would go and want to spend their gambling or their entertainment dollars at one of the casinos, playing blackjack or roulette or slot machines, is that it requires us as an industry, if they're going to participate in the racing industry, they can go up to the window and $2 a show on the 2-horse or make a 2-8 daily double, whatever they want. And that happens, I'm sure. But if you're going to be successful at it, you're going to have to study, as you said, the racing form.
Now, as I understand it, I mean, it went through some grueling times. What should be the formula for how many racing days to get to be able to conduct even the simulcasting? In fact, is my memory wrong that the state voters had to approve?
Well, we had a bill that was a constitutional amendment that was proposed, which would have allowed for the legislature to consider expansion of gambling. The legislature, the General Affairs Committee, exactly former State Senator Stan Shellpepper, requested that the Racing Commission hold some hearings and determine what is out there in terms of the interest of the public and the people of the state of Nebraska concerning expansion of gambling. Right now we have bingo, we have pickles, we have Powerball, you have the lottery, and you have pari-mutuel wagering on horse races, and that's the extent of gambling in Nebraska.
But didn't we have to have some special hocus pocus to get the simulcasting?
Well, there's still a state law that requires so many days of live racing for each track to simulcast, and that sometimes creates a big problem for Dennis trying to get the number of live days so that everybody stays on track and so that we can simulcast, because the simulcasting has been a big plus for the industry.
And if you go back in time, back in the 40s, when racing was originally adopted in Nebraska, there was a constitutional amendment. What we went to do to the people a few years ago is to amend that constitutional amendment, not to automatically bring in additional wagering opportunities, but to give the legislature the opportunity to pass legislation that would be constitutional, that would have allowed the introduction of, for example, slot machines at Exarban. To give you the difference of how that affects an industry, Prairie Meadows, before they introduced slot machines in Des Moines, was literally on the verge of bankruptcy.
I remember
They
many
introduced
news
slot
stories.
machines, and about 6 months later, not only had they turned the financial structure of the track around, they were supplementing purses, hiring additional people, and they were able to liquidate the debt that the Polk County people essentially had guaranteed, all in the course of about 8 to 12 months. And if they wouldn't have introduced slot machines, I think you would have seen the same thing happen at the racetrack in Des Moines at Prairie Meadows that happened to Exarban.
All right, so we couldn't do that. We couldn't expand gambling. And there are some moral sides to it, which we won't get into today, and certainly the gambling addictions, that's an issue. But as far as horse racing in Nebraska, then you had, I mean, you had a juggling act that was incredible, trying to save an industry and yet make it financially viable.
And Pete hit the nail on the head about dates. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's. I think we're still having a juggling act. You know, what's the optimum number of live racing dates, or what's the optimum number of live racing dates that can be profitable for both the tracks and the horsemen? That's the biggest juggling right now. You increase the number of days that we run, and you can't run for a high enough purse structure for the horsemen to make money. It's still a juggling act, and there's still a lot of debate over whether we should shorten meets so that the purse structures are higher, so that people have the opportunity to make more money. But if you shorten the meets, then you decrease the economic impact for each city that has the meet.
In terms of the horses and the
Right.
trainers and the feed that's purchased and all that,
Right.
so it is.
And it's tough, and you know, that's what's forced a lot of horsemen to race out of state, because they have an opportunity to run at higher purses.
I mean, if you don't run, you don't have races. I mean, it's whether you simulcast them
Exactly.
somewhere else or not. It's
Right.
And the problem we have is that the legislation requires that the commission essentially ensures that live racing continues in Nebraska. And to do that, when we meet in the fall of each year, we have to make sure that by the time we get to the start of the year with Fodder Park, that we have 120 live racing days somewhere in Nebraska. And right now we're focusing on our 4 remaining racetracks, which are Fodder Park, Horseman's, Columbus, Agricultural Park in Columbus, and State Fair Park in Lincoln. Those are our 4 remaining racetracks. Atticad used to be an element of the thoroughbred industry, but then they ran on some very serious financial problems, and the commission essentially did not renew Atticad's license because of those problems.
and that put more pressure on the other tracks.
Exactly. If we did not have 120 days of live racing, for example, this year, then nobody would be able to simulcast legally in Nebraska in 2000. It's a kind of a future year situation. Your 120 days must be for this year
Determines
in order to
next year.
simulcast. Exactly. And so we've always made sure at the end of that dates meeting, we don't leave the meeting until I'm sure that we have 120 days of live racing, because as the figures have shown, the simulcasting revenue that is generated by each of these tracks is so critical to the survival of the industry. Take Exarban out of the loop, we went through some very, very difficult times. The breeders, the horsemen, the tracks, everything affiliated with the racing industry went through those times. I think now we've weathered the storm. For example, Horseman's Park is now 19% ahead for the first 4 months of this year what they handled last year. It always shows what we've always known, at least I've always known, I think Pete agrees, is the fact that there's always been a strong base of support for the racing industry in Omaha and also throughout the state.
Now, Horseman's is going to have, we should mention, 1 additional day of racing this year. They're up to 3. They have a new stable. Went out and took a look, you know. Didn't look at the dirt on the ground, but I looked at it across the track. The thing, though, is that when Fodder Park is racing, as I understand it, I mean, the thing that's helping keep Fodder Park and the other parks alive, Fodder gets a huge chunk of the handle at Horseman's.
Right.
Now, was there any I guess it's a double-edged sword. You might resent the fact that you have to go through all those racing days, say if you're out at Grand Island, and all the work. I mean, it's a financially burdensome
Well, I think
operation, but on the other hand, they got the chunk of money for doing all that work.
they've come to the realization, you know, that they can't survive without the Omaha market, and I think they're being patient, and Omaha will take a step at a time. You know, they've got a big investment. I hope the commission is patient with them, because I know that you know that they will probably you know, increase as much as they can over the next few years, but we want to ensure that, you know, that this market is viable, and put too much of a strain on this market right away might kill it off, and that would kill the industry too. So I think the other tracks realize how essential this market is to them, and are a little patient with it.
I would agree with that. I think that Horseman's, what a lot of people ask me, well, why can't Horseman's run more dates? Which is a legitimate question. And you don't really have an answer to that question until you go out and you see the physical confines and limits that they have as a facility. one of the real problems in running more days is where are we going to stall horses? And the
They're
only
kind of
thing,
landlocked. I mean, they
Exactly.
really don't have a huge,
There's-
area of
there's
land
Q
as
Street
Exarban
is on
had.
the north end of the property. The Papio Creek is the western boundary. And then there's an auto salvage yard that's kind of the southern and part of the eastern boundary. And sure, you could acquire property and go south and east, but that takes two things, time and money. And so part of the problem that I think is with regard to the fact that they have that landlock and that they've been going very meticulously in terms of their financing to make sure they don't overextend, because nobody knows what the market's going to continue to be. This is a very volatile market. And so they're looking at it very cautiously, very carefully, and very conservatively. Ideally, what I've shared with the management of Horstman's would be my goal for Horstman's over the next 10 to 15 years would be to see Horstman's develop into the Saratoga of the Midwest.
And what does that mean? I'm not familiar with
Saratoga is a racetrack in upstate New York, and it has a lot of great tradition. They run a very abbreviated meet. It's not the period of time that Aqueduct and Belmont run in New York. And Saratoga runs probably about 3 to 4 weeks. That's it during the year. But during that time, the best horses in the country find their way to Saratoga, and they run for some top dollar purses. And it's a very kind of a Kentucky Derby Breeders' Cup environment all rolled into one during that limited meet. Horstman's has the ability to be that Saratoga of the Midwest because of the support that Horstman's has here in Omaha and around the area.
Can you envision that happening?
I would love to see it happen.
But I mean, realistically, would you?
Realistically, it's going to take time. But you know, if they continue to succeed over a short period of time, I think they can offer the purse structure that would bring those kind of horses in. And sure, they have limitations, you know, and sure, people that race there are going to have to deal with those limitations. But horsemen are pretty flexible. They ship in from all over the country at different times for different races. In Florida, they train at 3 different tracks to run at one. We can do the same in Nebraska. Lincoln isn't any farther apart than, say, probably Gulfstream and Calder. It's not that much farther, you know, to ship a horse from Lincoln than it is to Omaha. So, you know, sure, it has its limitations, but if they can offer the incentives, the horses will be here.
Help me with my dates. You mentioned Lincoln and Omaha and the proximity. Now, do the 3 race dates that Horstman's have, then does that dovetail into fairgrounds racing in terms of time?
It would be right
Close?
after.
Right after?
Right after the fairgrounds and before Columbus. It's kind of sandwiched in between there.
So, in other words, a horseman would feel some comfortability in terms of time and investing, moving his horse to the eastern half of the state for a while.
Well, it's just, horsemen, as Pete said, are very flexible individuals in terms of they'll take their horses wherever they can write the best race for them for that condition. The problem that we've run into in the industry is that with the exception maybe of Horseman's Park, all of the other racetracks are used for something else too, not just
i.e. the
racing.
fairground.
And so you can't turn the fairgrounds in Lincoln into a stabling facility for thoroughbreds for 6 or 8 months of the year, and you can't do the same thing at Fowler Park because they use their facility for something else too. And so that would be the primary negative of that aspect. But there's a lot of breeding farms on the eastern part of the state, and there's a lot of ability of people to really look at what the best resolution would be. And you take Horstman's, for example. When Exarban closed, the racing industry universally looked at itself and said, now what are we going to do? Because, and Pete mentioned it very well, that the Omaha market has been a real strong market, and for the whole industry, whether it goes from Atticat in South Sioux City to Fowler Park in Grand Island. And the Horsemen really were the group that stepped up to the plate and really organized that, took an unknown. And Dick Moore has done an outstanding job of leading Horseman's Park into the next century. I heard on the radio or read in the paper recently that the President's Commission on Gambling has suggested that there be a moratorium on all gambling.
Absolutely. In fact, it's in the Wall
expanded.
Street Journal today.
And I think that they've studied that for a year and a half. The racing industry has provided that commission with substantial documentation. The Racing Commission has provided that industry with a lot of documentation concerning what has happened in the Nebraska industry. We've seen what happens in the Nebraska industry when you've had incredible expansion.
Proliferation of gambling.
Exactly.
We're running low on time, and I have so many questions. With regard to Horsemen, we should mention that that track, for people in Omaha that say, oh, wow, the money's going to horse racing, they pay taxes. They are not for profit, but they are a tax-paying body. And I think Dick told me it was like $1 million last year?
There's a pari-mutuel tax that they pay, and there's also a regular emissions tax that is paid, and they have to calculate that and pay that monthly, and we get reports on that at the Racing Commission office in Lincoln.
Now, when you say there's still a core of racing fans, the fact that they're coming to see simulcasting at Horseman's, for instance, or I'm sure the other parks have some simulcasting.
They all do.
They all
Right.
do.
Is that just a pent-up demand for a form of gambling, or do you find that it's really the horse fan?
I think it's more the horse fan. I mean, you've got
Well,
gambling
it's not
everywhere.
like you don't have gambling
No,
opportunities.
you've got gambling everywhere in this part of the country. You know,
Sort of the culture
when
of horses, where you study the formal, as you mentioned earlier, that particular kind of
Well,
challenge.
a lot of people that still are going to Horseman's Park were just like you, junior jockey club members at Exarban, you know, and they grew up with that, and that was the only thing in town for a long time, and a lot of people just, you know, enjoyed not only just, I'd say the majority, a lot of them didn't even go to gamble. A lot of them just went to watch and enjoy the horses
And
themselves.
place of, just a
Yeah.
few bets just as an entertainment,
Right.
as much as gambling. Well, if I had never been out, and I'm sure there are a lot of people that haven't been out to the simulcasting, you don't get the same thrill you get when they pound across when you're standing out watching them run. But there is still something about watching horseflesh run.
Oh, you
Oh,
bet.
yeah.
That's really the attraction to it, and a lot of it, the industry has changed. I mean, telecommunications has changed from what it was 20 years ago. You would have never thought about being able to go to a track in Exarban and bet on the Kentucky Derby in terms of being
I remember
able
the
to watch
first time
it.
they did that. I
Exactly.
thought that was just
I
cool.
think that was what 1986.
Yeah,
I believe.
86, I think, might have been the first year.
Yeah,
that
they
you
just
could-
had a few
you could bet.
races then that
Exactly,
you
and
could-
now you can bet on all the races. If you go to Horseman's Park today, without knowing offhand the simulcasting schedule from morning to late in the afternoon, early evening, I'll bet that there's probably 10 or 11 different tracks that you can wager on, all the races at each of those tracks, in addition to the races at Fowler Park.
And money is being generated across the country
You bet.
for an industry and for the communities.
You bet. And the difference is you can go to any gas station or convenience store in the state probably and be able to buy a lottery ticket or be able to buy a Powerball on the drawing Saturday night or Wednesday night. But you have to go, there's only 5 locations in the state, now 4 actually, where you can bet on a horse race.
Well, we've run out of time. Dennis Lee, thank you for joining us.
Thank
And Pete Gross, and remember, they're still off and running
off
in
and running.
Nebraska. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
you.
for joining us.
Consider This with Carol Schrader is made possible with support from Allegiant Health and Bass & Associates.